Start the recording. Welcome to all of you zooming in from various parts in California and other parts of the world. We welcome you to WEED Art and Activism number 15 to spotlight the work of WEED member Cheryl Derricotte, who is a Bay Area based artist and has many other skills that she'll talk about. WEED Women Eco Artist Dialogue was founded in 1996, and it's a volunteer-run collective of women, female-identified visual artists, writers, curators, art historians, researchers, scientists, and others interested in highlighting the intersection of art and ecological issues. I'm Mary White, one of the co-chairs, with our tech co-chair, Manoush Zomorodinia, and possibly other board members joining us. We'll start with a land acknowledgement. And if you wish, we encourage you to put your land acknowledgement in the chat. WEED's office sits on the territory of the Wichen, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chichonio-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona tribe band of Alameda County. And we're near one of the largest shell mounds in the Bay Area. The land was and continues to be of great importance to the I'm sorry, I always say this wrong. Muwima Ohlone tribe and other familiar descendants of the Verona band. We recognize the Ohlone tribe, who are campaigning to become federally recognized, the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone, who are researching, revitalizing, and preserving Ramaytush Ohlone history and culture, and the Confederated Villages of Lejean and the Socorro Land Trust, which is working to return native land back to Indigenous stewards right here in the East Bay. Little Zoom housekeeping. We're recording this presentation. Please keep your audio muted during the presentation. The host may mute you if there's extra noise. And if you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat in the question sections. And we'll stop the first recording after Cheryl's presentation and immediately start a second recording with questions and answers. So now I'll introduce Cheryl. I'm just going to go over her biography, which is very impressive and wonderful. So she's a visual artist and her favorite mediums are glass and paper. Originally from Washington, D.C., she lives and makes art in San Francisco, California. Her art has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Chronicle, Merci SF, and the San Francisco Business Times. In 2021, she was awarded the commission to develop a monument to Harriet Tubman at the Transit-Oriented Development Gateway at Millbrae Station, the first sculptural tribute to the abolitionist in glass. Freedom's Threshold, a monument to Harriet Tubman, and it was unveiled in March 2023. She currently is serving as a Kala Institute Municipal Artist in Residence for the City of Berkeley's Climate Equity Pilot Program. In 2022, she was named the inaugural the BIPOC Artist in Residence at the Corning Museum of Glass in the studio. Additional honors include the Black Space Artist Residency at the Minnesota Street Projects, the 2022 Yerba Buena 100, an Oakland residency. This will take time. Villa San Francisco French Consulate micro residency, and many, many more residencies that you can see on the Eventbrite. And she will be, she was an emerging artist at the Museum of the African Diaspora in 2015-16 on the occasion of the museum's 10th anniversary. Her work is in many permanent collections, and including the DeYoung, the Historic New Orleans Collection, the Oakland Museum of California, and the National Association of Home Builders. Cheryl holds a BA in Urban Affairs with a minor in history, Barnard College, Columbia University, a Master's of Regional Planning from Cornell University, and a Master of Fine Arts from the California Institute of Integral Studies, a licensed city planner and member of the American Institute of Certified Planners since 1995. She serves as the Professional Development Officer for the new Arts and Planning Division of the American Planning Association. So with no further ado, let's introduce Cheryl.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who is here. I see some friends, which is exciting. We'll all be friends when this is over. But shout out to Anne and to Carrie. So happy you could join today. And especially honored because this lets me know people actually do read my newsletter or they actually do read the Instagram. So I'm glad that social media for good is in effect today. I am going to share my screen and get some slides up. Okay, and let me go to the full screen. Can everybody see the screen okay?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
And so I appreciate that we started with the land acknowledgement. And I always start my talks by saying that I stand for art and liberation. I actually believe that art is a perfect vehicle for us to have difficult conversations. And I tend to use the gallery and the museum as the brave space to hold those conversations. And so my own land acknowledgements also began on Ohlone land. My home and studio is in the place we call San Francisco. I'm originally from Washington, D.C., which is Anacostan land traditionally. And because I'm the last person on my matrilineal side of the family, I acknowledge Cherokee Nation land in a place we call Wytheville, Virginia in Appalachia. And so how it started in Washington, D.C. I would actually learn my craft of glass in a place called the Washington Glass School, which was started by two artists, Tim Tate and Erwin Timmers, and has continued with a third partner who came along during the years, Michael Janis. And on the left, you see the first glass house that I ever made. That piece was about 20 years ago, and it's called Shed Some Light. And I always show it because it was very much a foundational sculpture for me, in that it was mixed media to begin with. Text was very important, and text continues to be important in my practice, as you'll see as we go through the slides. And so the titling, both the text on the sculpture, really played into people's understanding of it. I often joke that I was tired of talking to people about poverty, so I just make a sculpture and maybe they'd get it then. And there was a lot I loved about this sculpture. It had a lot of heart, but it certainly did not have a lot of technique, which I'm sure Mary is laughing hysterically as another glass artist, but we all start somewhere. And so I still make glass houses, but they've gotten a little bigger. And so on the right, you actually see me unveiling Freedom's Threshold, which is the first monument to Harriet Tubman featuring glass as the primary material. It's a 12-foot aluminum frame. And then I made all of the glass inside where you see Harriet Tubman's image rendered. A little more difficult to see, but down at the base of the sculpture, there are actually glass brick shapes. So not as thick as a conventional brick, but the same dimensions of 2 by 8 inches. And each of the bricks, there are 14 bricks, and each brick has a word that pertains to her life. And so very difficult to figure out how to boil Harriet Tubman's life down to 14 words. So I got some help to do that. First off, 14 comes from the number of trips that most scholars agree she took on the Underground Railroad. She took the first trip by herself to freedom, and then about another 13 trips to liberate friends and family. And one of the sort of goals of my sculpture, which I think very much ties into our talk today, which is Your art, your voice. How do you find your voice, even if you're working amongst a variety of mediums, that it's still, people say, oh yeah, I get why that's your work, you know? In this case, one of the things that I felt like was sort of the unknown part of Harriet Tubman's story is how many assets she owned. Traditionally, we hear that she died poor, and she probably didn't have a lot of cash in the bank. But what she had was 32 acres of property that included at least 3 buildings and an additional barn area. And of those 3 buildings, one was her own 2-story brick house. The other was John Brown Hall, which was actually a hospital for formerly enslaved people, named after her friend, the abolitionist John Brown. And then the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, which was a retirement home for formerly enslaved people. And she actually died on property at the retirement home, because after she was advanced in years and could no longer take the steps in the 2-story brick, she moved into this 1-story retirement home property. And so, you know, when I hear, oh, a person died poor, I don't immediately think of someone who owned 32 acres and several buildings as a poor person. And so part of creating this sculpture was to literally place Harriet in the context of property. And so the sculpture itself is based on the side profile of her home in Auburn, New York. And for the 14 words, I actually reached out to the local AME Zion Church in San Mateo County, because at the time of her death, Harriet Tubman left her property to her local AME Zion Church in upstate New York. The church was delighted, because they're like, oh yeah, she's a central figure in church history. You know, we all know that story about Harriet Tubman. And so they helped me select words that pertain to her life. The other piece of her story that I feel like doesn't often get raised in a big way is her military service. And so aside from the Underground Railroad trips, Harriet Tubman actually was the first woman to lead a combat mission in the US, the Combahee River Raid. She was tapped by the Union Army based on her knowledge of the waterways and ways to evade enemies in the fields and, you know, in the woods. And so she helped navigate what was a central Civil War battle. And truthfully, that was where more people were freed than even during her trips on the Underground Railroad. It's estimated that 700 to 800 enslaved people were freed during the Combahee River Raid. And so as a result, believe it or not, one of the places in the US that has a memorial to Harriet Tubman, their own statue, is the CIA. Yes, I just said the CIA, because they actually teach Harriet Tubman as an example of military intelligence. And then we have the mountain road in between. And so I started my craft in DC, and one of the co-founders of the school, Tim Tate, really encouraged me to go into the Blue Ridge Mountains to a place called Penland. And for those of you who don't know, the Penland School of Crafts is the oldest craft education school in the US. It was started almost 90 years ago by Lucy Morgan. She began running weaving programs to help Appalachian women sell their traditional woven crafts. Penland is not that far away, but not right next door to another famous place I'm sure many people have heard of, Black Mountain, where, you know, just a host, including our local Rutha Sauer, were in school at Black Mountain. So there's such a deep, rich history in Western North Carolina. And I think that's part of the reason Penland has thrived in that environment for so long. They actually have a studio for everything, including glass, and it's actually where I learned how to blow glass. And so although I did not continue to practice as a glass blower, I did go the first time in 2003 for 2 weeks to take a class in large scale sculpture. I may not have used it for several years, but I took a class in large scale sculpture with Thurman Statham, who is probably the original famous Black glass artist. He actually studied originally with Dale Chihuly, who started the Rhode Island School of Design's glass program. And then, went on to have a fabulous career of his own, as well as doing a lot of public art. And so he's taught several times at Penland. So I took a 2-week class with Thurman, and then the next year, having got the bug, I was like, gee, I should be conveniently unemployed for 2 months. So I made that happen and took what's called a concentration at Penland, and I did 2 months in Venetian style glass blowing with Claire Kelly. Some of you may have watched the Netflix show Blown Away. Claire was on the last season of Blown Away and got put off way too early, in many of our opinion. But anyway, she did it, and she's a wonderful glass blower based out of the Corning, New York area at this point. And so it was, again, I didn't stay in any stretch of the imagination a glass blower, but it really rooted me in my craft. And it also has helped me through the years to be able to go into hot shops, to partner with glass blowers, to go on residency in places that has glass blowing, and be able to translate my work in a way that I can speak the language and know some of the tools, and we have a common understanding. Here are some examples of my work over the years. And so, and I'll give you some of the titles because, again, text is a part of it. But on the left is Gentrification by Nature. This was the suite of blown glass tornadoes that I made during the first class in 2003 with Thurman Statham, and then and his 2 TAs, Simone Fetzer and Dave Nato. And then on the top right is actually an altered book. That particular piece also made, all of this is work over the years made at Penland with different teachers. But that piece I made in a workshop with Susan Taylor Glasgow, who is a very well-known mixed media glass artist who does a lot with like feminist intersection of art in glass. She always says that her homemaking skills went astray. So she sews glass instead of sewing buttons on shirts and whatnot. She's very funny. And then at the bottom, is actually an example of enamel work. And that is more representative of the work I really settled into. And just so, for fun, what you're looking at there are the 3 forms of glass. So the top right, the book, is actually what we would consider cold glass. By today's standards, cold means anything below 1200 degrees, because most traditional stained glass practice, which used to be cold, and just cut the colors and put it into the leaded frame, a lot of those people now fire in a kiln to these lower temperatures of 1200 degrees. At the bottom, the enamel work, the little Buddha in the grass, that work is what's considered warm glass, and that's what I do now. And Harriet Tubman that you saw, her image is a warm glass process. So I have a kiln, I fire up to about 1500 degrees, which is kind of the top range for what's considered warm glass, and make my work that way. And then that tornado piece on the left is what's considered blown glass, because the furnace goes up to 2500 degrees. And people who, as well, if you've seen people work on torches and make figurines or make, pipes, those things, that's also considered hot glass, because those torches can actually get up to 2500 degrees as well. And so here's just a couple of images of work from my show at the Museum of the African diaspora. My show was called Ghost/Ships. It was a combination of glass portraits of formerly enslaved people and then hand-pulled prints, images of slave ships and old images of like, you know, people at work in the fields or in the cotton gins that I did to complement. It was probably 12 works on paper, 12 glass works, and then this central sort of video diary that showed some of the images that formed the basis of the glass work. And so you see how that gentleman's image translated into the glass. Part of what I do usually is not take the text off. So if I'm working with these historic images, you know, I didn't take all that German off of the image. It was an 1800s image. It was probably from one of the many books that were making, you know, justifications about race, supposedly scientifically as inferior. And so I like to leave some of that on the image. And then on the bottom right, you know, you see a woman with her hands up. And so in that case, you know, my title for the piece was Hands Up, Don't Shoot, to really root it in our contemporary dialogues about policing, even though the image itself came from a novel in the 1800s. You know, one of the things I love about us, as particularly as Americans, is that we have the most incredibly short memories ever, and we think everything just happened in the last 2 years or the last 5 years, when in fact, no, it probably happened about 200 or 300 years ago, and we're still continuing to unpack it. This is an example of, I always say, don't give your kids away too soon. There's always more than one way to work with your content. And so during the time of my MFA, I actually went back and got an MFA late in life. So I graduated in 2015. But during my MFA, I had worked part-time in Richmond, California, which is the site of the Chevron refinery. And it literally is right downtown. And so on the top right, you see a glass image that was actually in a show at the Richmond Arts Center. And it was my photograph of this train passing, and you see the refinery right behind it. And I was literally like across the street from all of that, because you see how close the actual street light is. And so I took a series of these photos. I made this particular image in glass for the show that was happening at Richmond Arts Center. I think it was around 2017 to 2018. And then I got, I'm on many mailing lists, as I'm sure many of you are, for opportunities, whether it's grants or residencies or shows or whatever, and was a call for environmentally focused work. And it was going to be on billboards. And I said, well, that's interesting. I think I want to look back at that series of photographs that I had taken a few years earlier in Richmond of the refinery. And so on the left, you see my billboard that was part of a show called Whistling in the Dark, which features one of my photographs, and I paired it with a quote from a Clean Air Task Force NAACP report that highlighted the fact that 6.7 million Black people in the US actually live near an oil refinery. So Richmond is not out of the ordinary in that sense, Richmond, California. And this work appeared, it was a Tri-City show. The billboards were all up in 2021 in February. My billboard had the great fortune of getting placed in Los Angeles at the intersection of Hollywood Boulevard and Wilcox. So as a friend said to me, if it wasn't the pandemic, 500,000 people a day would see your billboard. It is the pandemic, and there's still like 50,000 people a day that drive, you know, past this corner and see the work. One of the other billboard sites, which was like, you know, the great joy of my life, I didn't meet her, but it was Judy Chicago, and one of her polar bear images was also on a billboard as part of this show in Los Angeles. And then the other two cities were New York and Philadelphia. And so, you know, same work, very different context over a 5-year period. I like to work on paper as well. Most of my work is either glass or paper. I haven't done any other billboards to date, but this is an example of a handmade book that I made, Emily. And basically, I tried to find historic images to represent the items that were discussed in the wanted poster for her. Emily was a 17-year-old enslaved runaway. And so you see on the back of the book, actually the through line of the Ohio River, because that's where she was running to get away from the people that enslaved her. And, you know, I found some Confederate money because the wanted poster talks about this $100 reward for her. And it's just another way that, you know, you start to see this through line of like, oh yeah, this person has made work about formerly enslaved people. How does that come out in visual storytelling now in the medium of paper, not just in the medium of glass? And so just for scale purposes, this book is, I think it's like 6.5 inches by 27 inches, and then the ends are actually hardbound. And so I continue to make some books. About a year ago, I had a residency in New Orleans at a place called Paper Machine, which is a commercial press that is owned by a nonprofit called Antenna. Well, they're commercial in the sense that they do digital printing, but they very much serve like their parent nonprofit. They serve their broader community. And for a number of years, they had an artist residency program. And so I was originally supposed to go in April 2020. We know how that turned out. That's going to start to be a theme as we move through the remainder of the talk. And so I actually ended up going in November of 2021. And one of the things I had wanted to do was figure out how I could tie into New Orleans, but also tie into San Francisco. And I had just started doing some preliminary research into Mary Ellen Pleasant. And she, like Harriet Tubman, was a friend of John Brown. She was the richest Black woman in California during the gold rush. She ran boarding houses, laundries, restaurants, you know, all the things that bunches of men coming to like work and mine would need. And I'm always like, and of course she got rich in laundry because we know dry cleaning has always cost too much. So it had its roots in the gold rush. And she was just a fascinating person once I discovered her. She used to have a mansion in San Francisco at the corner of Octavia and Bush. And the original mansion was torn down, and all that remains are the 6 eucalyptus trees that she planted in her front yard. And they're quite sizable trees at this point. And so her second husband was rumored to be from New Orleans originally. And like many good New Orleans stories, he perhaps had been a cousin of Marie Laveau, the wonderfully well-known high voodoo priestess. Some stories say Mary Ellen Pleasant had actually studied with Marie Laveau. So I thought, okay, if I'm going to find the connection anywhere, I would find it in New Orleans. And that's what allowed me to do a lot of work at the Historic New Orleans collection while I was doing this residency. Well, we never found the husband. We definitely did not find that the husband was the cousin of Marie Laveau, nor did we find any proof that Mary Ellen Pleasant was actually involved with Marie Laveau. And also, which was really fascinating, I found out a lot of things that were reported in the San Francisco newspapers about her just weren't true, you know? And so in making these books, I really relied heavily on interviews that Mary Ellen Pleasant herself had given. I just decided I was going to stay in a space of truth, and I believe that the truth is whatever she chose to tell us back in the 1800s. And so here's a pleasant picture of my studio. This is like our promo shot with the rainbows, the double rainbow over the studio building. And this is inside of my studio. I have my own kiln. The top right image are some of the tools I use, again, because I'm working in warm glass practice. So I'm cutting sheets of glass. I'm using all those glass powders on the shelf to make my imagery in the big green kiln, whose name is Emerald City. And then I have a pretty good safety setup, which is always important in any glass environment. Keeping the flammable safe, you know, it gets boring how many times you cut your finger, not on purpose, but just, you know, because people like me have been doing it too long and don't wear gloves and pick up a glass and it's got a sharp edge because I haven't, like, you know, filed it down yet. And most importantly, eye wash, because if anything goes wrong, you want to be able to immediately get to some eye wash. And so shifting now to one of the projects I did that I think will help you really understand this whole notion of your voice and your art. So I had, like many people, a family that didn't necessarily think a professional artist was a great idea, but it worked itself out. So on the left is my mother, who really did not want me to be an artist. I learned much later in life from my grandmother, who was still alive at the time, that, you know, both my mother and father had been musicians. They had actually met in band, like in junior high school, long before they ever started dating in college, much less had me. And you know, she was very much an activist. You know, my grandmother said my mother used to take me to marches in the 60s, and she'd be like, you cannot take a baby to the march, but she would take me to the marches. And so then my mother did not understand how in the world could I be an artist and an activist. She just couldn't believe that was possible. And then the people on the right, that's actually a photo from their wedding, the very beautiful great Aunt Teeny and great Uncle Irvin. And so what was fascinating about this story is, after many years of, no, you can't be an artist, you can't be an artist, you know, you're old enough to do whatever you want to do with your life. And so in my 30s is actually when I found the glass studio in DC, and I fell in love with glass, and I announced, I'm going to just be a glass artist. I think it's fabulous. And my mother was like, I don't know about that. And great Aunt Teeny and great Uncle Irvin had been glass collectors their whole lives, and their faces lit up at dinner and they said, glass, we love glass, you know? And it really was the family version of the Civil War. And my mother knew she had lost because elders had now spoken. It was something they loved. And so she just gave up. It was like, okay, she pays her own way, glass, whatever, you know? And so so my great aunt and uncle, as my grandmother as well, all came from Wytheville, Virginia, the place I mentioned at the top, which is in Southwest Virginia, very close, not too far from West Virginia, very much NASCAR country. And so they knew all of the old glass factories in like West Virginia, parts of Virginia. You know, we were the kind of people that if the Blinky glass special came on public television, everybody stopped, dropped, and watched the glass special. So it wasn't, you know, unheard of for me to sort of say, oh gosh, I just love glass, because we had very much grown up with an appreciation of glass in our family. And they loved all of it, you know, from Waterford crystal at Christmas as a special treat or gift to like whatever they'd find over the years in antique shops that still had some work from the old glass factories. And so when the pandemic hit, I had been invited to do a group show at the French consulate. And when the curator spoke to me, you know, she said, oh, I would like you to be in this show. I've looked at your website. And I said, okay. And she said, well, it's really kind of about beauty and the transmutation of beauty. And I said, beauty? I said, you looked at my website? And she said, yes. I said, you kind of know what I do. And she said, no, I do. And I want somebody that's going to complicate the conversation. I said, okay, great. Because I'm just getting a hit right now on Thomas Jefferson. And she's like, go for it. And so I created this project to show at the French consulate, even though I'm going to say it again, 2020, we all know what happened, no show. And so the screens you're seeing on the left, I was actually posting on Instagram and sharing stories of my family. And then that first image on the right of Thomas Jefferson was the first triptych panel of this work. And so my mother's maiden name really was Jefferson. And although I personally have no interest in really doing the genealogical research to prove that we were related, she was very interested in doing that, and unfortunately did not live long enough to be able to do it. I mean, you saw the picture of my mother and my great aunt and uncle. It is wholly possible that we actually were related to the president, who knows? And this was also true, you know, where they came from in Southwest Virginia really was less than 3 hours from the plantation. So there might have been some credence to it. But I decided to sort of approach this opportunity at the French consulate this way because Thomas Jefferson was really, in many ways, our most notorious French ambassador. In those days, they actually didn't call it the French ambassador. They called it the minister to the court of Versailles. But, you know, in contemporary terms, we would think of him as the French ambassador. And so the middle panel actually centered the plantation. So that was a historical image of Monticello, and you can kind of see the different crops, including wheat, in the background of the plantation. And so I took sort of this old wallpaper motif and replaced it with images of wheat, because one of the crops Jefferson grew at the plantation in Virginia was wheat, because he loved his French bread from his time in France, and he very much would like to have that. He also really wanted to sort of distance himself from what he considered the more brutal crops of the South, like cotton, which was very popular in Georgia and Louisiana. So even though he wasn't an abolitionist, he still sort of wanted to straddle that fence like, oh, I'm not as bad as you guys down there. And then the final panel on the triptych is the wolf. And I picked the wolf for two reasons. One, very fabled, storied creature in French literature. There's a very famous quote in a number of writings that talks about the space between dog and wolf and this moment of fear when you're in the street, and is it a wolf or is it a dog, and you're not quite sure. So it's very much, you know, a metaphor for like making difficult choices in life. And the quote on the left was something that Thomas Jefferson said more than once. And so the wolf was actually his metaphor for the institution of slavery. And the quote actually goes on to say, justice is in one scale, self-preservation is in the other. So he was always very clear that there was sort of a moral imperative against slavery, but self-preservation, way of life of the South, which he, you know, enjoyed with a huge property in Monticello and 600 to 800 slaves, was self-preservation, and he wasn't prepared to, quote unquote, safely let the wolf go. And so now you see the triptych together. And so in that, you know, you still get to see a lot of my voice, even though we couldn't be together in physical space. It was a way to both combine visual storytelling, bring American history into our contemporary dialogues, because this was probably 3 or 4 years after Charlottesville and the terrible murders that occurred in Charlottesville at the big protest rallies that went on there. And so, you know, a lot of people, particularly younger generations, were kind of like, huh, how did all that happen in Charlottesville? And I'm like, well, when you're an hour from a plantation and you got a lot of unresolved issues going on in your society, it's pretty easy to understand why there could be a major race riot in Charlottesville. And sadly, someone was killed and many people were injured. And I always say, we may not personally be able to outrun our genes, but nations can't outrun their genes either. And so that's part of the reason we're continuing to have, in my opinion, some of the conversations that are still coming up around race, around, women's bodily autonomy, all the issues that we have not resolved over the past few hundred years. And so shifting gears, this is another project that I took on the past couple of years in the course of the same sort of conversation, specifically in the glass world. People were like, well, where are all those Black glass artists? And there aren't that many Black glass artists. Now, I will say, there's more Black glass artists than ever, but that still by no means makes a majority of artists, And so I was invited to do a show called Not Grandma's Glass, NGG, and it's run by Habitat Gallery, which is America's oldest glass gallery out of Detroit, Michigan. And they said, create 5 pieces of work, do whatever you want to do. Think about it would be in your dream museum. And I was like, okay, great. And I said, well, I think I want to make work about the history of glass that ties into this conversation. And so these are actually boys that worked in glass factories in Virginia at the turn of the last century. And so when I immediately saw this image, I said, well, there you go. There's Black glass artists right there that have been hiding in plain sight for the last 100 years. And then here's another image of how I translated the portraits of these boys into glass. They were actually mixed race in the factory. So that was also really interesting to me. On the one hand, it's the 1920s. America is incredibly segregated and no sense of change in sight, but the factory floor absolutely was not. It was fine for capitalism to be integrated, okay? The rest of the society did not need to be integrated. The other thing that I began to see in working with these historical images is that even the boys that were, visibly white were actually immigrant children. So a lot of them were Irish American, they were Italian American, they were Jewish American, so they weren't sort of like Northern blue blood Boston white. These were also, it was very much a part of America's immigrant story of who was actually working in these factories. And so you see images like this that has, the Black child mixed in with the white child in the photographs. And they're young. I mean, that's the other piece. They're children. And so these images were all part and parcel of a project that was done to sort of stop child labor in America. There was a photographer named Lewis Hine that was dispatched by a large American foundation to go into these spaces, to gather these photos, to create the moral sense of outrage that children were working in such harsh conditions to make changes to labor laws. Another portrait, all Black glass children, all Black children that were working in the glass factories at that time. And then, for all of us artists, I always say, well, find your crew. I mean, clearly, even though they were tiny, there was so much about them that were still just like glass blowers and all swagger and hands on their hips and hand out on the shoulder, even though they were 10, which is outrageous that they were working, next to 2,500 degree furnaces. And so, as I said, this work was originally shown online at Habitat Fine Art in Detroit. 2 of these panels are actually traveling to Tacoma to the Museum of Glass this fall. So they'll actually get shown in person, which is exciting. There is going to be a show of Black glass artists from the diaspora, like all over the world, at the museum that opens October 20th. And so I think we made it at 5:46 with at least 14 minutes, all right, for Q&A and dialogue. Thank you so much.
All right, well, let's give her all a virtual hand of applause. And thank you, Cheryl. So now we'll go on to questions and answers, questions and comments and dialogue. So thank you very much. It's beautiful.